32 men entered the tunnel on March 4, 1945. Filipino laborers forced at gunpoint to carry wooden crates deep into the limestone caves of Luzon. The crates were so heavy that it took 2 men to lift each one. Inside, gold bars stamped with the seals of banks that no longer existed. Banks in Singapore, Rangoon, Hong Kong, cities that had been stripped bare by 3 years of Japanese occupation. The men worked through the night, stacking the crates in a chamber carved 200 feet below the surface. Japanese engineers stood watch, smoking cigarettes, checking their watches. At dawn, the last crate was positioned. The engineers nodded to each other. Time to leave. The laborers started walking back toward the tunnel entrance. They had gone maybe 50 feet when they heard it. A sound like thunder rolling through the earth. Then the ceiling came down. Tons of rock and concrete, triggered by carefully placed explosives. The tunnel collapsed in sections, sealing itself from the inside out. The men at the rear were crushed instantly. Those closer to the exit ran, screaming, clawing at the walls as the dust cloud overtook them. The engineers stood at the entrance, watching the mountains swallow the evidence. 32 men had entered. 0 came out. This was not murder. This was operational security. And it happened not once, but dozens of times across the Philippine Islands in the final months of World War II. Because the Japanese were not just losing a war, they were hiding the greatest treasure hoard in human history. $14 billion in gold, platinum, diamonds, and looted art. The accumulated wealth of an entire continent, stolen piece by piece, city by city, temple by temple. Manila, February 9th, 1945. The battle for the city has entered its most brutal phase. American artillery hammers Japanese positions around the Intramuros, the old Spanish walled city. Buildings collapse into rubble. Fires rage out of control. In the streets, Filipino civilians lie dead, caught between 2 armies that show no mercy. Japanese soldiers, knowing they are trapped, have begun massacring anyone they suspect of helping the Americans. Women, children, entire families pulled from their homes and bayoneted in the streets. Before the battle ends, over 100,000 civilians will die in what historians will call the Manila Massacre. But while the slaughter continues in the city center, something else is happening on the northern roads. Convoys. Dozens of military trucks, their cargo beds covered with canvas tarps, grinding through the chaos toward the mountain provinces. These trucks do not carry ammunition or medical supplies. They carry the reason Japan came to the Philippines in the first place. They carry Golden Lily. General Tomoyuki Yamashita stands on a ridge overlooking the Cagayan Valley, watching the convoy snake through the jungle below. He is 59 years old, exhausted, and under no illusions about how this war will end. 3 years ago, he was a hero, the Tiger of Malaya, the man who conquered Singapore in 70 days and forced the British to their knees in the most humiliating defeat in their military history. Winston Churchill himself called it a disaster. Yamashita called it inevitable. Now, standing in the Philippine mountains with American forces closing in from every direction, Yamashita faces his own inevitable disaster. But he has one final mission, one last order from Tokyo that matters more than any military victory. Hide the treasure, bury it so deep, so completely, that even if Japan loses, even if the Americans occupy every island in the Pacific, they will never find it. The wealth will stay in Asia. Ready. Waiting. Financing. Japan's return to power in 10 years, 20 years, however long it takes. The treasure represents 3.5 years of systematic plunder across Southeast Asia. Operation Golden Lily, named after a poem Emperor Hirohito wrote as a young man, though there is nothing poetic about what it actually involves. Teams of specialists, accountants, and art experts and mineralogists traveling with the advancing Japanese armies, emptying bank vaults, confiscating private collections, stripping anything of value from occupied territories. They are methodical. They are thorough. They are absolutely ruthless. When Singapore falls in February 1942, the Japanese seize control of the banking capital of Southeast Asia. The vaults beneath the Cathay building alone contain 53 tons of gold bullion, British colonial reserves, Chinese merchant wealth, Malay royal treasures, all of it loaded onto ships bound for Manila, the central collection point for Golden Lily operations. In Burma, soldiers strip golden plates from the Shwedagon Pagoda, one of the holiest sites in Buddhism. In Java, they empty museums of artifacts dating back 1,000 years. In Borneo, they seize the Sultan's ceremonial regalia, jeweled daggers, and diamond-encrusted crowns. Nothing is sacred. Everything has a price. Prince Chichibu, Emperor Hirohito's younger brother, personally oversees Golden Lily. He maintains meticulous records, at least initially, ledgers documenting every seized asset, every confiscated bank account, every looted temple. But as the war turns against Japan, as American submarines begin sinking transport ships in the Pacific, the ledgers become a liability. Too much documentation, too many witnesses. By 1944, Prince Chichibu orders the records destroyed. From now on, Golden Lily operates on trust and memory. Only a handful of men know the full scope of what has been taken. Only they know where it is being hidden. The hiding operation requires industrial-scale engineering. Japanese military engineers, trained in tunnel warfare and fortification construction, begin transforming natural cave systems across the Philippines into underground vaults. They work at night, using prisoner labor and local civilians, forced at gunpoint to dig deeper, carry heavier loads, install support beams, and ventilation shafts. The caves extend hundreds of feet into the mountains. Some connect to underground rivers, others lead to dead-end chambers where the treasure is stacked floor to ceiling. Major Kojima Kashi oversees one of these operations near Baguio City in northern Luzon. A career officer, 42 years old, Kashi has spent 2 years in the Philippines and wants nothing more than to go home. But he has his orders. Seal the treasure. Eliminate the witnesses. Leave no trace. On the night of March 7th, 1945, Kashi watches as 75 Filipino laborers finish stacking the last of the gold bars in a chamber his engineers have designated Site 14. The chamber contains approximately 175 tons of gold, 22 tons of platinum, diamonds in wooden boxes, Buddha statues, solid gold, stolen from temples in Thailand. The estimated value exceeds $2 billion. Kashi gives the signal. His engineers detonate the charges. The tunnel collapses in stages, each section designed to seal the one behind it. The laborers do not even have time to scream. The mountain absorbs the sound of the explosions. By morning, nothing remains but a rockfall that looks entirely natural. Kashi writes a brief report using coded language. Cargo secured. Workers dismissed. Site sealed. He sends the report to Yamashita's headquarters, then burns his notes. Years later, after the war, after the trials, A Filipino survivor named Ricardo Magsaysay will testify that he escaped one of these tunnel collapses by hiding in a side passage. He claims he heard the screams of men buried alive, heard them pounding on the rocks, calling for help that never came. Magsaysay says he waited 3 days in the darkness before digging his way out through a collapsed section of tunnel. When he emerged, Japanese soldiers were gone. The war was over, and he was the only man alive who knew exactly where one of Yamashita's treasure sites was located. But when he returned with excavation equipment, he found the tunnel entrance had been sealed with concrete and covered with earth. Someone had made sure no one would ever find it. By September 1945, Japan has surrendered. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast on radio for the first time in history, tells the Japanese people that they must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. Unconditional surrender, occupation, the end of the empire. General Douglas MacArthur returns to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise. I shall return. He establishes his headquarters in Manila and begins the process of rebuilding a country devastated by 3 years of occupation and months of brutal fighting. Yamashita surrenders on September 2nd in the mountains of northern Luzon. American soldiers escort him down from his headquarters, a crude camp hidden in the jungle. He looks gaunt, defeated. His uniform is filthy, torn in places. Journalists photograph him standing next to American officers who tower over him, the Tiger of Malaya reduced to just another prisoner of war. But Yamashita says nothing about treasure, nothing about Golden Lily, nothing about the tunnel systems and sealed chambers scattered across the islands. The Americans put him on trial for war crimes. The charge is command responsibility for the atrocities committed during the Battle of Manila, the massacre of civilians, the rape and murder of women and girls, the systematic destruction of hospitals and churches. Yamashita's defense argues that he lost effective control of his forces in the chaos of the battle, that the troops in Manila were acting independently, that he issued orders forbidding atrocities. But those orders were ignored. The tribunal does not care. MacArthur wants justice for the 100,000 dead civilians. He wants someone to hang for what happened in Manila. On December 7, 1945, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the tribunal sentences Yamashita to death. His lawyers appeal all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court denies the appeal in a split decision. Justice Wiley Rutledge writes a scathing dissent, arguing that Yamashita is being executed for crimes he could not have prevented, setting a dangerous precedent for command responsibility. But the execution proceeds. February 23, 1946. Los Baos internment camp, 40 miles south of Manila. Guards lead Yamashita to the gallows at 5:27 in the morning. A crowd of journalists, military officials, and Filipino civilians has gathered to watch. Yamashita climbs the 13 steps slowly. He wears a clean uniform provided by his American captors. At the top of the platform, he turns and bows to the witnesses. Then he speaks his last words. I will pray for the emperor's long life and his prosperity forever. Nothing about treasure, nothing about gold. The trapdoor opens, the rope snaps tight. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, dies at 59 years old, taking his secrets to the grave. Or so everyone believes. Within 6 months, the treasure hunters arrive. Former American soldiers who served in the Philippines during the occupation. Filipino locals who claim their fathers or uncles were forced to work on the tunnel sites. Japanese nationals who somehow obtained maps or documents before fleeing the islands. They come with shovels and metal detectors and wild stories about golden Buddhas and chambers filled with platinum bars. They dig in caves. They excavate hillsides. They find nothing but empty tunnels and false leads. But occasionally, they find something that keeps the legend alive. In 1948, a locksmith named Rogelio Roxas claims he discovered a tunnel system in Baguio City. According to Roxas, he and a team spent months excavating until they broke through into a chamber containing a golden Buddha statue over 3 feet tall, along with stacks of gold bars. Roxas says he managed to remove the Buddha and bring it to his house. But before he could return for the gold bars, armed men burst into his home, beat him unconscious, and seized everything. Roxas believes the men worked for President Ferdinand Marcos, who has developed an obsession with Yamashita's treasure. Marcos spends the next 20 years funding excavation projects across the Philippines. He hires engineers, geologists, even psychics, who claim they can sense where the gold is buried. Some researchers estimate Marcos spent over $50 million of public funds chasing the treasure. Did he ever find anything? That depends on who you ask. After Marcos flees the country in 1986, investigators searching his properties find maps, documents, and photographs related to treasure hunting operations. They also find evidence of massive, unexplained wealth. Billions of dollars stashed in Swiss bank accounts. Real estate purchases that make no sense given his official salary. The Marcos family claims the wealth came from investments. Critics claim it came from Yamashita's gold. Professional historians and geologists dismiss the entire legend as fantasy. They point out the logistical impossibilities. Moving billions of dollars worth of treasure through war-torn territory would require hundreds of trucks, thousands of workers, and massive engineering projects that could not possibly remain secret. Yet no credible documentary evidence has ever surfaced. No authenticated Japanese military records mention Golden Lily burial sites in the Philippines. Every map that surfaces turns out to be fake. Every document is forged. Every witness testimony contradicts every other witness testimony. But here is what cannot be dismissed. Japan absolutely did loot Southeast Asia on a massive scale. Thousands of tons of gold, platinum, and precious materials disappeared during the occupation. After the war, Allied forces recovered some looted wealth from Japanese facilities, but most of it simply vanished. The official accounting has never added up. Billions of dollars worth of treasure remains unaccounted for to this day. It went somewhere, it exists somewhere, or it existed, and someone found it, and they are not talking. So the legend endures. The treasure hunters keep digging, the researchers keep searching archives for new clues, and every few years someone claims they have found the real location, the genuine map, the authentic key to unlocking Yamashita's fortune. None of them ever produce actual treasure, but none of them ever stop believing. Because belief, it turns out, is more powerful than evidence. And in the summer of 1946, someone in American intelligence realized that belief could be weaponized, turned into bait, used as a trap. If treasure hunters believed the gold was real, if Filipino locals believed the tunnels existed, then perhaps Japanese intelligence operatives who refused to accept that the war was over would believe it too. And if they believed it, they would come looking. And when they came looking, they would walk straight into a carefully prepared ambush. The Americans would not need to find Yamashita's gold. They would simply need to convince the right people that they already had found it. Then sit back and wait for the enemy to reveal themselves. Operation Golden Trap was about to begin. The man who first said the words did not believe in legends. He believed in leverage. It is August 1946, less than a year after Japan's surrender. In a cramped, smoke-filled office in Manila, a group of American intelligence officers stand around a table covered with maps of Luzon. Some are Army counterintelligence, some are from naval intelligence. Others wear no insignia at all. They are not here to debate whether Yamashita's gold is real. They are here to decide how to use the belief in that gold as a weapon. On the wall hangs a large map of the Philippines, dotted with colored pins. Red pins for reported execution sites, yellow for abandoned Japanese positions, blue for locations where locals claim they saw trucks at night, or heard explosions in the hills, or watched their relatives vanish into Japanese work details and never return. The blue pins outnumber all the others. That is the problem. And, for someone in this room, that is also the opportunity. A colonel from Army counterintelligence taps one of the blue pins with the tip of his pencil. Here, he says. 3 separate testimonies. Same mountain range. Same time frame. Trucks. Explosions. No returning workers. Either we are looking at another mass grave, or we are looking at one of the burial sites everyone keeps whispering about. A younger officer, barely 30, leans forward. Sir, with respect, even if that is a burial site, we do not know what is buried there. It could be ammunition. It could be engineering equipment. The Japanese were blowing up tunnels everywhere. The colonel does not even look at him. It does not matter what is there, he says. What matters is that they think they left something there. And if they think it, they might come back for it. That is the moment the operation is born. Not as a fully formed plan, not as a signed directive, just as a shift in thinking. The treasure is no longer an objective. It is a magnet, something that can pull out of the shadows the people who refuse to accept that the war is truly over. Because by 1946, it has become clear that some Japanese officers did not surrender with everyone else. Intelligence reports from across Asia speak of die-hard elements. Former members of the Kempe Tai, the feared military police. Officers from naval intelligence. Hardline nationalists who believe the occupation is only a pause, not an end. Some have gone underground in Japan itself. Others have vanished into the chaos of post-war Asia, aided by sympathetic networks in Taiwan, Korea, and the Philippines. These men have 3 things in common. They still possess skills the empire spent years developing. They still have contacts among former collaborators, black market traders, and ex-soldiers. And they still believe Japan must one day rise again. American intelligence officers in Manila understand something crucial. Men like that do not just disappear. They need money. They need safe houses. They need leverage. And if any of them know or believe they know where even a fraction of the golden lily treasure is hidden, that knowledge is their lifeline, their bargaining chip, their ticket to a future underground struggle. So the Americans decide to make them spend that ticket. The first phase of the plan is simple. Make it look like the Americans have already found part of the treasure. They start with rumors. Nothing official. Nothing on paper. Just casual comments in the right places. A loose-tongued supply officer in a Manila bar, complaining loudly that his unit is guarding some underground vault when they should be going home. An engineer bragging to a girl in a dance hall that he has seen more gold in one tunnel than Fort Knox has in its vaults. Stories seeded among dock workers, jeepney drivers, servants working in American compounds. To make the rumors believable, the Americans stage visual evidence. On an isolated hillside in central Luzon, engineers dynamite the entrance to an abandoned Japanese tunnel system. They clear just enough debris to create a cavern mouth. Inside, they place a small number of real items recovered from captured depots. Japanese-marked ammunition crates refilled with gravel to mimic weight. A few low-value gold objects from documented war loot already in American custody. Not bullion from Fort Knox. Nothing that would cause a political scandal if it went missing. Just enough to convince observers that something valuable has been found. Then they assemble a very visible security cordon. For 3 days, a company of American military police guards the site. Trucks arrive and depart in broad daylight. Floodlights burn all night. An obvious antenna is set up, and operators pretend to be sending encrypted traffic. Locals watch from a distance. Some are chased away. Others are deliberately allowed to linger at the perimeter long enough to see wooden crates being loaded into covered vehicles. The Americans do not announce what is in those crates. They do not have to. The human mind rushes to fill in blanks, especially in a country where everyone has heard stories about missing Japanese gold. Within a week, whispers reach the markets in Manila. They say the Americans have found one of Yamashita's vaults. They say trucks full of gold have rolled south towards the port. They say the Americans are sending the treasure to the United States. By the time these stories reach former Japanese officers hiding in safe houses, the details have already grown. From a few crates to dozens. From a small tunnel to an underground palace. The second phase targets a different audience. Former collaborators, businessmen, and middlemen who once did business with the Japanese occupation authorities. American interrogators in Manila prisons have already identified several such men. Black market dealers who supplied the Japanese army with fuel and food. Bank clerks who helped launder confiscated assets. Harbor pilots who guided Japanese ships into secluded coves under cover of darkness. On paper, these men are small fish, not important enough for prosecution. But they have something more valuable than rank. They have memories. They remember who was moving what and where in the final months of the war. So the Americans make them an offer. In a private room, under the hum of a ceiling fan, an intelligence officer sits across from a former shipping agent who worked for the Japanese in late 1944. You helped them move cargo, the officer says. We know that. That is not what interests us. What interests us is who came back after August 1945, who was still asking questions, who was still trying to find the things that went missing. The agent hesitates. He knows too much. He also knows that knowledge is dangerous. But the Americans offer him a deal. Leniency, protection, maybe even a way to rebuild his business under the new regime, if his information proves useful. Slowly, the names begin to surface. A former naval intelligence officer who now lives quietly on the outskirts of Manila, but still makes regular trips to a coastal town where Japanese submarines once docked. A businessman who once transferred gold from Hong Kong to Manila, and who has recently met twice with a man using a false identity, but speaking flawless, educated Japanese. A former Kempei-tai interpreter who disappeared from his village after asking persistent questions about a particular mountain road used by truck convoys in early 1945. These names form the skeleton of what American intelligence starts to call, in internal memos, the remnant network. Men without uniforms, without flags, but not without purpose. The third phase of the operation is the most dangerous. The bait must be placed where the remnant network can see it, but not so openly that it looks like a trap to everyone else. American officers begin to circulate a very specific story through intermediaries known to have past ties to the Japanese. The story goes like this. During a routine survey of war damage, an American engineer unit stumbled upon a partially collapsed tunnel system in northern Luzon. Inside, they found signs of recent Japanese excavation, fresh timber supports, empty crates with markings linked to Golden Lily convoys, a few scattered gold items missed in the evacuation. According to the tale, the Americans secured only one chamber. The survey report suggests there may be additional sealed sections deeper in the mountain, but the unit involved has been ordered back to the United States before further work can be done. This story is a fiction built around a kernel of truth. A real engineer unit did inspect several tunnels. They did file a report. The report is then edited, embellished, and selectively leaked. A Filipino interpreter who has been subtly turned into an asset repeats a slightly exaggerated version to a known former collaborator. An American officer pretending to drink too much in a particular bar complains loudly about short-handed survey teams and idiot superiors who ignore his warnings about an unfinished tunnel that, in his words, could be hiding half of Tokyo's reserves. No one prints this in a newspaper. There are no official briefings. It is all done in the gray zone of gossip and half-truth, precisely where intelligence professionals like to work. The rumor begins to circulate among the people the Americans most want to reach. Former Japanese officers hear it third hand, but the pattern is familiar. Multiple convoys, remote caves, sealed chambers. It sounds exactly like the operations they used to plan. Inside a safe house in Manila, two former officers of the Imperial Japanese Army quietly argue over the story. It is a trap, the older one insists. The Americans want us to move. They want us to show ourselves. The younger one shakes his head. If they had truly found it, he says, they would not be talking. They would have removed everything in secret and told the world nothing. The fact that this rumor exists means the site is not fully explored. Maybe they found an outer chamber. They are too busy sending troops home to dig deeper. If we do nothing, the site may collapse or flood. The Emperor's property will be lost forever. That phrase, the Emperor's property, still has power even in defeat. It is not greed that finally sways them. It is a twisted sense of duty. They convince themselves that they are not thieves, not looters, but guardians recovering what rightfully belongs to their nation, so that one day Japan might stand again. American intelligence has anticipated this rationalization. That is why the rumor is structured the way it is. Not that the Americans have found everything, just that they have found enough to make inaction unthinkable to a true believer. The final piece of the plan is physical surveillance. In the mountain valley designated as the supposed site of the tunnel, a small team of American reconnaissance specialists moves into position. They establish concealed observation posts on ridgelines overlooking the approach roads. They map likely footpaths and choke points. They bury field telephones and string wire. No one wears uniforms when they move in. They pose as surveyors, forestry workers, even missionaries passing through. Their orders are clear. Watch the area. Log every unfamiliar face. Record number plates of every truck and jeep that does not belong to local farmers or traders. Look for men who move like soldiers, who scan tree lines without realizing they are doing it, who speak in low, controlled tones, even when they think no one is listening. The Americans do not know exactly when the bait will be taken. Intelligence work does not follow a shooting schedule. It moves at the speed of human fear and human hope. But the officers who designed Operation Golden Trap understand one thing with absolute clarity. If the legend of Yamashita's treasure has enough power to send poor farmers with shovels into the hills, if it can drive a dictator like Marcos decades later to spend millions digging empty holes, then somewhere in the fractured world of defeated Japanese intelligence, there are men willing to risk everything to find what they believe was buried. Those are the men the Americans want. Not the peasants, not the freelance looters, the planners, the couriers, the former officers who know the old code words and recognize the old markings on crates. The ones who can rebuild networks, pass messages, and turn stolen gold into weapons and influence. So the Americans set the stage. A half-whispered story here, a suspiciously well-guarded tunnel there, just enough smoke to convince their enemies that a fire is burning under the mountain. Then they step back into the shadows, waiting patiently for the first silhouettes to appear on the trail. American patrols saw them before they even reached the valley. It was late November, 1946. The monsoon rains had ended, leaving the mountain trails slick but passable. In a village that barely appeared on any map, a squad of American scouts watched a group of strangers step off a battered truck and into the dirt street. For weeks, the scouts had been told to wait for exactly this kind of arrival. Men with Japanese faces who clearly were not fishermen, not farmers, not merchants. Men who moved like soldiers, even out of uniform. The group numbered 6. The villagers watched them with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The strangers carried small packs, not heavy loads like laborers. Their clothes were simple, but too well made for peasants. Their boots were good leather, worn but cared for. One of them, a man in his late 30s with a stiff, measured walk, carried himself with the unconscious authority of an officer. The Americans, observing through field glasses from the tree line above, gave him a name in their reports before they learned his real one. The captain. The captain's real name, the Americans would later discover, was Nakamura Kenji. Formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army, once attached to a logistics unit that had coordinated Golden Lily shipments between Hong Kong and Manila. Nakamura had survived the final months of the war by abandoning his uniform, burning his papers, and disappearing into the black markets of Manila. But he had not abandoned everything. He had held on to a fragment of something far more valuable than money: memory. He remembered a particular convoy, in early 1945, diverted at the last minute from its planned route to a different mountain region. He remembered the orders written in a hurried hand, bearing a code group he recognized as Golden Lily Priority. He remembered the face of the major who took charge of the convoy at a junction in the road. Major Kojima Kashi. A name that meant nothing to the Americans yet, and everything to Nakamura. For months after the surrender, Nakamura had stayed silent. He watched American troops march. He watched Japanese prisoners loaded onto ships for repatriation. He watched war crimes trials from the back of crowded rooms. He drank cheap liquor and told himself the empire was finished, that there was no point in chasing ghosts buried in the mountains. Then the rumor reached him. A collapsed tunnel in northern Luzon, American engineers stumbling onto partly cleared chambers, empty crates with golden lily markings, gold objects scattered on the floor like crumbs left in a hurry. The rumor did not sound like something invented by a peasant. It sounded like an engineer's report, half overheard and clumsily repeated. And for men like Nakamura, that kind of rumor did not fade. It burrowed into the brain and grew there, fed by remembered convoys and lost orders, and the knowledge that billions in treasure had vanished without explanation. So Nakamura began to look for others who had the same disease. He found them in the quiet corners of Manila's post-war underworld. A former naval intelligence petty officer who once monitored shipping logs for unregistered cargo. A railroad supervisor who recalled moving sealed cars at night under Army guard. A clerk who had handled transfer papers for unexplained special consignments routed away from ports in the final months before the American landings. Nakamura did not tell them everything he knew. He did not mention Kashi by name. But he told them enough. Enough to convince them that the emperor's property was still somewhere in the hills, and that the Americans had touched only the edge of it. They formed a team, small and covert. No uniforms, no flags. Just 6 men with false identities and hidden pasts, moving under the cover of legitimate travel. On paper, they were traders, agents for a Japanese company interested in purchasing lumber and copra. Their papers were good enough to pass casual inspection. The Philippines in 1946 were full of such men. What made them different was not what they carried openly, but what they carried inside their heads. From the American perspective, the moment they stepped off that truck into the village, the operation shifted from theory to contact. In a concealed position above the valley, 2 American observers tracked the newcomers through binoculars. One of the observers, a sergeant from Texas, noted how the captain scanned the rooftops as he walked, how he automatically positioned himself where he could see both ends of the street. This was not the behavior of a merchant. This was the behavior of a man who had lived through ambushes. The watchers relayed coded updates along a wire line buried under the soil, up to a listening post higher in the hills. There, an intelligence officer began a log that would, if everything went to plan, become the first entry in a capture file. Entry 1. 6. Japanese males, approximate ages late 20s to early 40s. Civilian clothing. Appear familiar with fieldcraft. 1. Designated captain. Exhibits clear signs of prior command experience. From the village, Nakamura's group hired 2 local guides. The guides did not know who the men really were. They only knew there was talk of good pay for anyone willing to lead them into the foothills, along old logging trails and forgotten tracks that the Japanese army had once used during the occupation. The Americans let the hiring happen. They needed the group to feel safe enough to behave naturally. The journey to the supposed tunnel site took 2 days. On the first day, the group moved cautiously, but not like men expecting an ambush. They were alert, but not paranoid. They stopped often, both to rest and to study the terrain. Nakamura carried a folded scrap of paper, a rough hand-drawn map that combined his memories from 1945 with the half-remembered stories of other former soldiers he had questioned in the months before. It was not precise. It did not need to be. He was looking for patterns. A bend in the river. A cut in the cliff face that matched something he had seen from a truck window long ago. On the second day, the group's behavior changed. They entered a narrower valley with steep sides and dense vegetation. The air felt heavier. The trees blocked much of the sun. The guides became more nervous, glancing at the ridgelines as if expecting something to move. The captain spoke to them in slow, careful Tagalog, asking about old Japanese positions, old caves, old roads. One guide pointed toward a slope where the undergrowth looked strangely uniform, as if it had grown back over disturbed ground. "We used to hear explosions there," the guide said, "during the war, at night, sometimes trucks, sometimes lanterns moving in the dark. Always soldiers with rifles who told us to stay away." Nakamura's pulse quickened. The Americans watching from above saw the moment too. Through their scopes they saw the captain stop and stare at the slope, eyes narrowing as if he were seeing, layered over the present, ghosts from 2 years before. The group made camp early that evening, at the edge of the tree line below the suspicious slope. The guides built a fire and cooked rice and dried fish. The Japanese men ate in silence, each lost in his own calculations. After dark, one of them produced a folded strip of cloth marked with symbols, not a full military map, a fragment, the remaining piece of something larger cut away or destroyed. He laid it out on the ground, weighed the corners with stones, and they bent over it together, shielding it from the firelight. Up on the ridge, an American observer saw only their hunched backs and the faint movement of their hands. But he did not need to see the map. The very act of unrolling it here, at this spot, told him everything he needed to know. This was not random wandering. This was a search anchored to something remembered. Something that had survived fire and surrender and 2 years of occupation. The next morning they went to the slope. There was nothing there to a casual eye, just soil, shrubs, and tree roots. But men who had lived through Golden Lily operations knew what to look for. A slight change in the angle of the ground. Rocks that did not match the local geology. A faint, unnatural line in the vegetation where the earth had settled over time. They began to dig. It was not delicate archaeological work. It was men attacking the ground with shovels and iron bars, driven by a mixture of greed, duty, and desperation. They dug for hours, sweat soaking through their shirts, mud streaking their arms and faces. The guides watched uneasily from a distance. The Americans watched from above, tracking every movement, sketching rough diagrams of the emerging depressions. This was the moment the operations designers had anticipated and feared in equal measure. If the Japanese found nothing, they might retreat and vanish, becoming rumors once more. If they found too much, they might panic, or try to move the treasure out in ways the Americans could not control. Ideally, they would find just enough to confirm their belief, just enough to make them reach out to others, drawing more of the remnant network into the open. Late in the afternoon, one of the diggers' shovels struck something that was not rock. The sound was dull, hollow, with a faint metallic ring beneath it. The man dropped to his knees and clawed at the soil with his hands, exposing a dirty, splintered surface. Wood. Old, compacted, but intact enough to hold shape. They cleared more. A corner emerged, then an edge, a crate, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. No markings visible yet, The men froze for a second, breathing hard. Then Nakamura leaned in, pressing his fingers to the wood as if to confirm it was real. "Here," he whispered. They lifted the crate together, muscles straining. It was heavy. Not impossibly heavy. Not like a box filled with solid gold bars, but heavier than empty timber. They dragged it out of the hole and set it on the slope, brushing dirt away to reveal faded black characters stenciled on the side. The Americans on the ridge could not read the markings, but they saw the Japanese men's faces change. Tension became something sharper. Recognition. Golden Lily code groups were designed to look meaningless to outsiders. To the right eyes, they were anything but. Nakamura's hands trembled as he traced the symbols. "This is one of ours," he said softly. This was not munitions. This was special cargo. They pried the crate open. Inside, packed in straw that had darkened with age and moisture, lay rows of dull, yellow metal bars. The bars were not pristine. They were stained, spotted, some with tiny flecks of corrosion. But their color was unmistakable. Gold. The moment held for several seconds, suspended between disbelief and confirmation. Up on the ridge, an American observer, watching through his scope, saw the posture of the men below change. Shoulders straightened, heads lifted. It was like watching a fuse catch. He spoke quietly into his field telephone. "They have opened a crate. The reaction is consistent with positive identification. I say again, they think they have found gold." The crate did not contain enough to match the wild tales that had circulated for years. It was a fraction of what the legends promised. But to Nakamura's group, it was proof. Proof that their memories were not lies. Proof that the Emperor's property was indeed buried in these hills, and that at least part of it had survived the chaos of defeat. For the Americans, it was proof of something else. These men were not random scavengers. Random scavengers did not walk directly to a sealed slope, dig in the right spot, and produce a crate with golden lily markings on their first serious attempt. That required knowledge. That required access. That required prior involvement in the machinery of looting and concealment. For a brief moment, the question hung in the air on both sides, though from different angles. What now? "Down in the valley," the Japanese men argued. "We cannot move it all with just us," one of them said. "We do not even know how many crates are here." "We send word," another replied. "Carefully. Not to everyone, only to those we trust." The captain listened, his eyes fixed on the open crate. In that dull yellow metal he saw not just wealth, but a path to power, to leverage, to something beyond the humiliation of surrender. But to walk that path, he would need allies. He would need resources. He would need to take a risk. On the ridge, the American officer running the observation post closed his notebook. "We let them go for now," he said to his men. "We do not need the small fish. We wait to see who they call." The trap had not sprung yet. The jaws were still open. But for the first time, bait and prey were in the same place, bound together by a legend that had become, in this valley, a solid, heavy fact. And somewhere in Manila, on a desk in a secure office, a file folder labeled "Golden Trap" waited for its next report. By the time Nakamura's group left the valley, American intelligence already knew more about them than they knew about themselves. The 6 men walked back toward the village in the fading light, packs heavier by only a few samples wrapped in cloth, but minds overloaded with something far weightier than metal. They had seen enough to be certain. The crate they opened was not random, wartime scrap. It bore golden lily markings, and the gold inside had the right dimensions, the right weight, the right feel. For men who had pushed similar crates off similar trucks in 1944, it was like recognizing an old comrade in a crowd. They did not speak much as they descended. The guides felt the tension, but did not understand its source. To them, the gold bar Nakamura had allowed them to glimpse for motivation was a miracle that could feed their families for years. To Nakamura, it was a key, not to wealth alone, but to leverage and resurrection. In Manila, the first contact report from the observation post was already being summarized and rewritten in cleaner language for senior eyes. The phrases were cold, stripped of the heat and sweat and pounding hearts in that valley. Subject group appears to possess prior operational knowledge of golden lily sites, demonstrated direct approach to buried cache with minimal exploratory activity. Behavior suggests access to pre-existing mapping or memorized route. Behind such language, a silent conclusion formed. They are not done. They are just beginning. Doubt inside the Japanese network. 2 nights after returning from the mountains, Nakamura sat in a dim back room above a noodle shop, facing 3 men who had not risked the journey with him. One had been a naval intelligence officer in Shanghai. Another, a bureaucrat from the Finance Ministry's Overseas Assets Division. The third had worked in military transport in Taiwan. All 3 had dirty hands from the war years. All 3 had avoided formal prosecution by slipping beneath the flood of bigger names and bigger crimes. Now their greatest fear was not American justice. It was irrelevance. Nakamura placed the cloth-wrapped bundle on the table and unfolded it. The gold bar lay in the center of the rough wood, like an accusation. Not bright, not polished, dull and scarred from its time underground, but its weight was undeniable. Each man, in turn, lifted it with both hands, as if testing not just the metal, but the reality of the moment. "You are certain of the marking?" the naval officer asked quietly. Nakamura nodded. "It is from a late-war consignment," he said. "The code group fits the Luzon transfer schedule. It was never meant to go back to Japan by sea. It was meant to stay hidden until we could return for it. Until we could, or until someone could," the finance official corrected. "We are not the only ones who remember." That was true. Memory of routes and caches was scattered across dozens of men, perhaps hundreds, all over Asia. Many were dead. Some were in prison. Some were living under assumed names, trying to forget. But not all. The question was how many of those men would be foolish enough or desperate enough to act. "We do not have the resources to move a large cache alone," the transport man said. "We will need equipment, labor, safe transfer points. If we try to hire too many locals, word will spread. If we contact too many of our own people, word will spread even faster." Word spreading was the core of their dilemma. They needed help, but every additional person brought added risk. Not just of betrayal for money, but of something worse. Exposure to the Americans. "They are not blind," the naval officer said. "You think they do not hear the same rumors we do? You think they are not listening in the markets, the bars, the ports? If they had found the site themselves, we would have heard nothing. The fact we even had these whispers means they know something, but not everything." The room went quiet. Nakamura broke the silence. "We act slowly," he said. "We do not send letters. We do not use telegrams. We contact only people we have seen in battle, men who did not break under pressure. And we do it face to face." "You will expose yourself," the finance official said. "We already did." Nakamura replied. "When we dug, when we opened that crate. If the Americans were watching, they already know someone is looking. The only safety now is in moving fast enough that we stay ahead of their understanding." The American adjustment. Several miles away, in a guarded compound that had once been a wealthy family's villa, an American major covered the same basic problem from the opposite side of the chessboard. He stood in front of a rough map of Manila, on which colored pins had multiplied in the last 48 hours. Each pin represented a sighting, a reported conversation, a change in routine. A former Japanese clerk seen entering a known safe house twice in one day. A man matching Nakamura's description, meeting an old naval acquaintance near the docks, their heads close together, their voices low but tense. A Filipino middleman, previously observed maintaining a careful distance from ex-Japanese circles, suddenly making himself available. "This is what we predicted," the major said. "Contact radiating outwards from the core group. They found something. Now they are trying to build capacity." A captain at the table frowned. "Then why not roll them up now, sir? We know at least some of their names. We have enough to justify arrests on collaboration charges. The longer we wait, the more they can bring in. The more complicated this gets." The major shook his head. "We are not after names on old paperwork," he said. "We are after structure. We need to see who they trust enough to invite in. We need to see what routes they use, where they move money, who they talk to outside the city. If we grab them now, we get 6, maybe 10 men. If we let them run on the leash a little longer, we map an entire network." "And if they get spooked?" the captain asked. "Then we learn something about their sense of danger," the major replied. "Either way, we get data." He did not add what everyone in the room knew. Waiting also carried risk. A few tons of gold, moving in the dark, could become guns in the hands of future insurgents. It could become seed capital for underground political movements, for smuggling routes, for exile organizations in cities as far away as Bangkok or Buenos Aires. The Americans were playing for intelligence, not treasure. But that did not mean treasure had no consequences. Inside the spiral over the next weeks, the pattern tightened. Nakamura's small circle began to expand in careful increments. They approached former officers one by one, always in places where an unexpected encounter could be passed off as coincidence. A shrine, a market, the edge of a repatriation center, where Japanese civilians awaited transport ships home. Some said no immediately. Some tried to pretend they did not understand the indirect language about unfinished responsibilities and assets left in trust for the nation. A few walked away and never looked back, terrified of prison, or worse, of their own memories. But others listened. Others leaned forward. In one smoky boarding house, Nakamura spoke with a former Kempeitai intelligence handler, who had run informants in Manila during the occupation. The man's eyes were flat, his face showing little. When Nakamura finished describing the crate in the mountain, there was a long pause. "You are a fool," the former handler finally said. "The Americans are good. They may be clumsy sometimes, but they are not blind. If you found anything, they have already marked you. This is bait." Then he slid something small across the table. A slip of paper bearing only a name and a town in northern Luzon. "If you are determined to be a fool," he said, "at least start with someone who still knows how to move unseen in those hills." He stood up and left without another word. The name on the paper belonged to a former guerrilla liaison who had once helped Japanese units bypass certain American patrol routes. a man who had survived by switching sides twice. Untrustworthy. Perfectly suited to the gray zone Nakamura now walked. Every time Nakamura took a step outward from his original circle, American logs fattened. An intercepted message here, a sighting there, a license plate noted by a bored Filipino police constable outside a boarding house now on the Americans' watch, but do not touch yet list. The operation began to look less like a straight line and more like a spiral, tightening around a point neither side fully saw. The first fracture. The spiral could not expand forever without stress. That stress arrived in the form of a man named Sato. Sato had been a quartermaster sergeant in 1944, in charge of assigning trucks and drivers to various convoys leaving Manila. He was coarse, practical, and had survived the war largely by pretending not to hear things that did not concern him. After the surrender, he made a living buying and selling whatever could be moved, from stolen fuel to scrap metal. He was not ideologically driven. He believed in money and in staying alive. When Nakamura approached him, Sato listened, eyes narrowing, mouth pulled into a skeptical line. "Gold in the mountains," he said. "You know how many times I have heard that in the past year?" Nakamura did not show him the bar. Instead, he showed him something Sato respected more. Details, convoy numbers, road junctions, the way certain trucks had been ordered to remove identification plates before leaving Manila. The names of officers who had signed for deliveries that never showed up at any port. Sato's skepticism eroded as he realized Nakamura was not parroting marketplace gossip. He was reconstructing a piece of the very system Sato had helped operate. "If you pull this off," Sato said slowly, "you will need transport, real transport, not just mules and local carts. You will need to move heavy cargo at night without drawing eyes. That costs money." "We can pay," Nakamura replied. "With what?" "The promise of money later. People cannot eat promises." Nakamura finally unwrapped the sample bar. Sato went very quiet. That night he did something Nakamura did not anticipate. He drank too much, and he talked too loudly in a bar that was watched by the wrong set of eyes. Not American eyes. Filipino. A local fixer, who made a tidy living feeding small bits of information to both sides, overheard enough to understand the general outline. Japanese, gold, mountains, trucks. The fixer had no loyalty to anyone but himself. He had been burned once by a Japanese officer who fled without paying him in 1944. Since then, he preferred American money. The next morning, a note containing fewer details than Sato had babbled, but more than Nakamura would have liked, found its way, via a chain of hands, to the desk of the American major. The major read it, then placed a fresh red pin on his Manila map. The spiral had not just widened, it had cracked. Tightening the net. "We are past the point of pure observation," the major told his staff that afternoon. "We cannot assume we have full visibility anymore. If local actors are starting to sniff around, this gets messy fast." "What do you recommend, sir?" the captain asked. "We compress the window," the major said. "We let them make a few more moves, but we start shaping their options more aggressively." Shaping their options meant subtle pressure. A particular road in the north, once lightly patrolled, now saw an increase in routine American vehicle checks. A warehouse near the docks, rumored to be a good place to stash contraband, was quietly raided on a different pretext, sending a ripple of nervousness through the smuggling community. A Filipino policeman, known to accept bribes from ex-Japanese circles, was suddenly transferred to a distant district. None of this pointed directly at Nakamura's group, but all of it raised the ambient level of risk. The effect was predictable. Inside the Japanese network, nerves frayed. "We must move soon," the finance man insisted. "The longer we wait, the more eyes there are, the more chance some drunk opens his mouth in the wrong bar." "We cannot move a large quantity without preparation," the transport man countered. "If we rush, we lose control. A single mishap, a single broken axle on the wrong road, and everything collapses." Nakamura listened and understood that both were right. Time was the enemy, so was haste. The only constant, the only fixed point, was the gold buried in the mountain. It was patient. It did not care who came for it. Men, on the other hand, bled and panicked and made mistakes. "We take one more trip," Nakamura said finally. "Only a few men. Only enough to confirm the scale of the cash. After that, we either commit fully or we walk away." No one believed they would walk away. Back to the mountain. When Nakamura's smaller team set out again for the valley, the Americans were ready. Observation posts had been reinforced. A second ring of watchers, further out, monitored approach routes. A radio relay had been tested and retested. Medical personnel were placed on alert without being told exactly why. The order from above was clear: no engagement unless absolutely necessary. No shooting unless fired upon. The primary objective remains identification, not annihilation. For the men on the ground, that meant something simple and nerve-wracking. "We let them get close to their dream," one American sergeant muttered to another as they checked camouflage on their position. "Then we snatch it away." The second approach to the slope felt different from the first. The valley was the same, the tree line, the shape of the land. But the men walking into it carried more than tools now. They carried expectation, fear. They reopened the previous dig with frantic energy, expanding it sideways, probing for the edges of the chamber. In the process, they exposed a second crate, then a third, partly crushed by soil pressure, but still intact enough to resist their crowbars. As more markings emerged from the dirt, the picture became clearer. This was not a random dump. This was a node in a deliberate grid, a carefully constructed cache, one of many, connected by routes and schedules that only a handful of living men now understood. Nakamura stood on the slope, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin, and realized the full enormity of what lay under his feet. "We need more men," he said quietly. "This is beyond us." He was not just thinking of the work. He was thinking of protection, of secrecy, of the storm that would follow if anyone else realized what was here. What he did not see, 2 ridges away, was another layer of realization building. The American major, who had come forward to the field for this second phase, watched through a powerful telescope as the Japanese men uncovered crate after crate. He saw no wild celebration, no shouting, just grim recognition. "They are not surprised by the scale," he said to the captain beside him. "That means they expected something like this, which means they know at least one more site of comparable size." The captain exhaled slowly. "We cannot let this grow, sir. If they tie this site to others before we move, we will be chasing shadows for years." The major knew that. But he also knew something else. The longer he watched, the clearer the faces below became. The more certain he could be when he matched them to files back in Manila. The more connections he could draw between the men in the valley and the names in old Japanese documents and new street reports. Every minute of delay increased both danger and intelligence value. It was a balance that could not hold forever. Down in the dirt, Nakamura ran his hand along the edge of a newly exposed crate and made his own calculation. "We go back one more time," he told his men. "We go back, we expand our circle, and then we commit everything." In his mind, everything meant trucks in the night, carefully timed movements, bribed sentries, looking the other way. On the ridge, the major came to a different endpoint. "Everything," he said quietly, "is exactly how much we are going to take from them when the time comes to close the jaws." The 5th chapter should close the story on 3 levels at once. Nida yoya aoya. Nyoya nyo anyoya yoyan cio a cio stoa. Chapter 5. What remained after the trap? They did not hear the first aircraft. It was too high, too far, just a faint vibration in the sky above the valley, as dusk thickened between the ridgelines. Nakamura and his men were deep in the pit, levering another crate out of the packed earth, when the youngest among them paused, shovel halfway through a stroke, and glanced up. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Another snapped, not looking away from the crate. The sound faded. The work resumed. No one wanted to be the first to admit unease. On the ridge, binoculars followed every movement. The Americans had waded through 2 full trips to the mountain. They had watched the circle grow, tracked names, faces, and routes. Now the roster in the major's folder was thick enough that when he flipped through the photographs and scribbled notes, he no longer saw 6 men in a valley. He saw lines radiating from that valley to Manila, to port towns, to old Kempeitai contacts who had once broken people with their bare hands. Tonight, the waiting ended. Orders had come down from above in language that left no room for misinterpretation. Containment. Capture where possible. Lethal force authorized only in direct response to hostile action. The phrasing was clean. The reality would not be. As full dark settled, the work in the pit slowed. Oil lamps flickered. Shadows deepened around the crates stacked near the slope. Nakamura checked his watch. They would camp here again, make one more push in the morning, then withdraw to plan the full extraction. He did not know that, as he calculated, lines of men were already moving through the jungle above him. American squads advanced without talk, hand signals passing between them like small electric shocks. Faces blackened, boots wrapped to muffle sound, weapons held close. They had drilled this approach for days, over and over on the far side of another hill, using a rough model of the valley sketched out with sticks and stones. Now the rehearsal became the thing itself. At a prearranged signal, the distant aircraft circled back and dropped a single flare high above the far ridge. To men in the valley, it looked like a falling star. The world snapped white for a heartbeat, then bled into harsh green shadows as more lights ignited on the American side. They did not point directly at the pit. They washed over the entry slopes, over the tree lines, flooding the approaches with enough glare to blind a night-adapted eye. Someone shouted. Someone else scrambled for a pistol. Nakamura's first conscious thought was not, "They have found us." It was, "We are too exposed." Shapes appeared at the edge of the light. Voices barked in English and in sharp, practiced Tagalog. "Hands up. Do not move." The moment stretched, quivering between fight and surrender. One of the Japanese men went for his weapon anyway. It was clumsy, more reflex than tactic, a desperate lunge toward the pack where his pistol lay. In the glare and confusion, someone fired. One shot, then 3 more in ragged echo. The man fell onto the open crate, his blood smearing across dull yellow bars. The echo of gunfire bounced off the rock walls and rolled down the valley like the memory of a much larger battle. Then silence, except for the shouted commands. Down, face down, hands where we can see them. In that silence, something inside Nakamura gave way. Not courage, something older. The thin strand of denial that had let him believe, until this instant, that he was still playing by old rules, that the Americans were slow, clumsy giants. He could move around with care and timing. He lay down slowly, hands spread on the damp earth. Around him, his men did the same, one by one. The guides threw themselves flat, screaming that they were only there for pay, that they were only villagers, that they knew nothing. The Americans bound everyone anyway. In the first sweep, they could not afford to sort innocence from guilt. The operation that had begun as a whisper about a tunnel ended with boots thudding on soil and plastic ties cinching tight around wrists. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. The Americans did not shoot anyone else. They did not have to. Shock did much of the work for them. The captured men were marched, stumbling, up the slope toward a staging area behind the first ridge. There, field lights and temporary wire enclosures had been set up hours before. Medics moved among the prisoners, checking for wounds, for hidden weapons, for signs of collapse. Nakamura found himself on his knees in front of a table made of 2 crates and a plank. Behind it stood the major, field jacket open at the throat, glasses catching the glare. "You have been busy," the major said in careful, accented Japanese. Nakamura did not answer. The major glanced past him, down into the valley, where other Americans were now photographing the pit, cataloging crate markings, tagging each box with neat, waterproof labels. "You were never going to get it all out," the major continued. "Not with the eyes we have on these hills, but you came close enough to bring friends. That is what we needed." He did not shout. He did not threaten. The trap had already closed. There was no need for theatrics. Back in Manila, the paperwork would list the Valley raid in dry terms. Detention of enemy remnants, seizure of contraband. No mention of Yamashita. No mention of Golden Lily. The gold, such as it was, would be classified as recovered looted property, inventoried, and moved under guard to a secure location. Years later whispered about as if it had never existed. For the men in the wire enclosure, the story took a different shape. Interrogations began within 24 hours. Some of the captured Japanese tried to hold out. They fell back on wartime scripts, giving name, rank, and little else. But this was not a battlefield. This was a gray zone, 2 steps after surrender, where old codes had faltered. The Americans did not torture them in the ways men had learned to dread from the Kempeitai. They used time, isolation, the careful drip of information that made it clear resistance would not protect anyone still at large, because those men were already under watch. "We already know about Major Kashi," one interrogator told Nakamura. "We know he ran at least one site near Baguio. We know he burned his papers. What we need is not names on a page. We need patterns, roots. If you do not help fill in the blanks, someone else will, and you will have broken for nothing." For perhaps the first time since he walked out of his uniform, Nakamura faced not a question of loyalty, but a question of mathematics. How much did he truly know? How much could the Americans verify? How many of the men he might be trying to protect still clung to the idea of a future Japan fueled by the Emperor's stolen treasure? In the end, most of the information that mattered did not concern individual crates or specific coordinates. It concerned structure. The interrogations, cross-referenced with documents the Americans had already collected, confirmed the broad outline of Golden Lily as an organized program rather than a chaotic smash and grab. They revealed logistics paths, code words, transfer points. They identified officers who had likely been involved in similar burial operations in other parts of Asia, even if those officers were now out of reach in occupied Japan or neutral countries. The mountain cache thus accomplished two missions. It pulled a live network into the open, and it validated, in the Americans' internal files, the central belief that something like Yamashita's horde had existed not as a fantasy, but as a system. For the captured men, the price of that validation was years of confinement. Some were eventually repatriated quietly, their names scrubbed from public lists. Some disappeared into legal gray zones, too minor for show trials, too compromised for simple release. A few died in custody, their stories ending in margins no one outside the intelligence community ever read. The valley itself changed slowly. The crates were removed in stages, under guard, mostly at night. Earth movers filled the pit. The entrance slope was recontoured, replanted with fast-growing trees. Within a handful of seasons, only someone who had seen the ground torn open would know exactly where it had been. Local stories, of course, did not care about contour lines. In the nearest village, the tale took on a familiar rhythm. Foreign soldiers, trucks, lights in the night, rumors of gold taken away. Wives of the two guides swore their husbands had seen bars of precious metal with their own eyes, only to be threatened into silence. Over time, the threat itself became more important than the facts. "Do not go into the hills," parents told children. "There are ghosts there, and the Americans will shoot you if you find their treasure." The ghosts, as always, outlived the men who made them. What then remained? Not a clear verdict on Yamashita's gold. The valley cache was large enough to prove that Japanese forces had indeed buried treasure in the Philippines. It was not large enough to settle the argument forever. It was one note in a larger, dissonant chord. In basements and archives, reports on the operation gathered dust under classification stamps. Analysts moved on to new crises: Korea, Indochina, the slow, grinding birth of the Cold War, the idea of using legends as bait, of letting belief do half the work of surveillance, did not disappear with the crates. It became another tool on the shelf, pulled down and repurposed as needed. Years later, former American officers would recall the mountain raid, if they recalled it at all, as a footnote in a career of footnotes. The men on the other side did not have that luxury. For Nakamura, if he survived the tangle of interrogations and transfers, the memory of the open crate under the flare, lit sky would remain the pivot point of his life. Before, the gold had been a possibility, a ghost of duty and ambition. After, it was a weapon turned back against him. He had believed he was moving through a forgotten war to reclaim something lost. Instead, he had walked straight into a war he did not even see, one fought with files and rumors and patience. For the Philippines, the valley was one more scar hidden under jungle. One more place where foreign powers had dug for something that was never meant to be theirs, argued over ownership with flags and accents that did not match the river or the soil. And for the legend, the operation did something paradoxical. By never officially acknowledging the raid, by burying the details under classification and euphemism, the Americans fed exactly what they had exploited. Ambiguity. The story of Yamashita's treasure thrived, not in official communique, but in the spaces between what everyone knew and what no one could prove. Each whispered account of a tunnel, each map drawn on aging paper, each tale of soldiers appearing in the night and then vanishing again. In those spaces, people could believe anything, that all the gold had been taken by Americans who built secret war chests, that most of it still lay in untouched chambers, waiting for the right map and the right men, that the entire thing had been a lie from the beginning, a mirage created by desperate looters and credulous hunters. Somewhere between those extremes lay the truth, that gold had been stolen, that some of it was buried, that some of what was buried was found, and some was used as bait to catch men who would not let the war end. In the end, the most dangerous part was never the metal itself. It was the conviction it produced in those who chased it. For Yamashita and his superiors, that conviction had justified sealing men alive in tunnels. For Nakamura's circle, it had justified stepping back into the light when safety lay in remaining a shadow. For American intelligence, it had justified building an operation not around what was real, but around what people needed to believe. Decades later, tourists would stand in Manila, listening to guides talk about lost wartime treasure. Hikers would walk the trails of Luzon, unaware that under certain slopes, the earth had once held more than roots and stone. And somewhere, on a screen, a story about cursed gold and a trap in the mountains would play out in images and voices, not as a neat moral lesson, but as a reminder that in war, and in what comes after war, the most powerful currency is not gold. It is the stories men tell themselves about what that gold can buy.